Between 1847 and 1852, the Tennessee River Valley in northern Alabama became the stage for one of the darkest and most mysterious chapters in Southern history. Three powerful plantation families, wealthy, respected, untouchable, collapsed in ways so strange that even the newspapers refused to print the details. 23 people died, not just from fever or accidents, but from something far worse, something no one dared name. The truth was buried for over a century, sealed away in court records, journals, and ledgers. But at the center of it all was one woman, a woman called Rachel, whose intelligence and quiet determination would expose the terrifying secrets behind the genteel surface of plantation life. Welcome to Liturgy of Fear. Before we uncover what really happened in those houses along the Tennessee River, make sure you're subscribed and have that bell on so you never miss the stories history tried to erase. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing where our truth seekers are listening. Now, let's begin part 1, The Arrival of Rachel. Limestone County, Alabama, 1847. The river glimmered in the July heat, carrying barges heavy with cotton toward New Orleans. The valley was alive with the sound of labor and profit. Three families ruled this land: the Rutledges of Fairmont, the Haverhills of Riverside, and the Crenshaws of Oak Ridge. Their fortunes, their reputations, and even their rivalries were woven into the soil itself. The Rutledge plantation stretched over 2,400 acres of rich farmland, with 87 enslaved workers and a grand white-columned mansion that gleamed like pride itself. Samuel Rutledge, the master of Fairmont, had come from South Carolina with money, ambition, and connections to the state legislature. His wife, Catherine, came from Virginia and carried herself with the quiet arrogance of old blood. Their 3 children were being raised to continue the family's dominance, 2 sons studying at university and their youngest, Lydia, a sheltered 19-year-old whose beauty and innocence were the talk of the county. Just upriver lived Judge James Haverhill, owner of Riverside Plantation. His estate was smaller but more modern, with machinery that promised higher yields. He was a man obsessed with appearances. His wife, Margaret, and their 4 children served as the perfect image of Southern respectability. And beyond them stood Oak Ridge, the Crenshaw estate, run by the widower Daniel Crenshaw. He had no interest in social niceties. His home was plain, his manners blunt, and his focus entirely on business. These 3 families represented the heights of wealth and power in northern Alabama. But before 5 years had passed, their homes would be empty, their fortunes gone, and their names whispered in fear. It began with a purchase. In April 1847, Samuel Rutledge traveled to Mobile to settle debts and acquire supplies. At an estate auction, one listing caught his attention: a woman named Rachel, 24 years old. The auctioneer described her as literate, skilled in needlework and music, and fluent in both French and English. The notes on the sale were strange. She was being sold by special decree, and the buyer had to take her at least 100 miles from Mobile. The price, just $400, was unusually low for a trained house servant. Samuel saw opportunity. His wife had long wanted a proper companion and tutor for their daughter, someone refined, cultured, and capable of elevating Lydia's manners. A French-speaking servant would add elegance to their household. When he asked about the odd sale conditions, the agent shrugged. "Some legal matter," he said. "Nothing to worry about." Samuel bought Rachel that day. When she arrived at Fairmont 3 weeks later, Catherine Rutledge was instantly pleased. Rachel was tall, graceful, and carried herself with an ease that seemed far above her station. She spoke softly, obeyed instantly, and performed her duties with precision. Within days, she was tutoring Lydia in French conversation and embroidery, organizing household routines, and earning her mistress's trust. For 6 weeks, everything seemed perfect. Rachel was the kind of servant every Southern lady dreamed of: quiet, respectful, and efficient. But by midsummer, small changes began to ripple through the house. Lydia started spending long hours with Rachel, whispering in corners, laughing one moment and falling silent the next when others entered the room. The younger house servants began avoiding Rachel's gaze. Meals grew quiet. A strange tension filled the halls. Rachel asked questions, always polite, always curious. She wanted to know which planters paid their debts, which ones drank too much, whose sons were engaged, whose daughters were spoiled, and who gambled away their inheritance. The questions seemed harmless, but she was collecting something, information. She noticed Samuel's growing frustration with his ledgers, how he muttered to himself over columns of red ink. She understood that his debts were growing, that he had been borrowing money against future harvests. She saw that Catherine's refinement hid deep worry, and that Lydia's innocence made her easy to influence. By July, Rachel had become the invisible center of Fairmont. She was in every room but never truly seen. Catherine trusted her. Lydia adored her. Samuel relied on her. And yet none of them really knew her. Then came the night of July 14, 1847. Samuel sat in his study, the air thick with the smell of tobacco and storm. Outside, thunder rolled across the fields. Rachel entered quietly with a tray of coffee. She set it down, hesitated, and spoke softly. "Sir, if I may be so bold," she began, her eyes downcast. "You mentioned Mr. Haverhill at dinner. I once served in a household that dealt with his brother in Mobile. There are matters you may wish to know." Samuel looked up. "What matters?" Rachel told him, calmly, precisely, about Haverhill's hidden debts, his failed business deals, his shady associates in New Orleans. She described details no servant should ever know. But everything she said was verifiable, and every word promised an advantage Samuel desperately needed. He should have wondered how she knew so much. But greed and fear clouded his judgment. He listened, asked questions, took notes. By the time she left, Samuel had decided to use her information to blackmail Haverhill into a partnership that could rescue his collapsing fortune. Outside, the storm broke with sudden fury. Lightning struck the old oak tree beside the main house, splitting it down the center. Servants said they saw Rachel standing at her window, watching the rain, her face lit white by the flash. That night marked the beginning of something the people of Limestone County would later call the river haunting, a chain of tragedies that would destroy 3 families, shake the courts of Alabama, and blur the line between justice and evil. And at the center of it all stood Rachel, calm, patient, and waiting. End of Part 1, The Arrival of Rachel. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for Part 2, where Samuel Rutledge's plan turns from ambition to obsession, and the true nature of Rachel begins to reveal itself. Would you like me to write Part 2, 1,000 words, same style and tone, next? Hook. By the summer of 1847, whispers had begun to circle through Limestone County. Fairmont Plantation, once a symbol of order and prosperity, was now a place of tension and unease. Servants spoke in low voices. The mistress had taken to her bed. And the master, Samuel Rutledge, was making secret deals with his rivals, his desperation growing by the day. What no one knew was that the true source of their unraveling was not money, nor rumor, nor misfortune. It was a single woman, newly arrived, quiet, intelligent, and patient as the grave. Her name was Rachel, and every house she entered soon fell into ruin. Welcome back to Liturgy of Fear. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, and click that bell so you never miss a chapter from America's forgotten past. In the comments, tell us, would you have trusted Rachel? Let's continue with Part 2, The Disappearance of Lydia. July 14, 1847. That date would later be remembered in court records, church ledgers, and whispered conversations as the day the trouble began. The first death wouldn't come for months, but the poison had already entered the heart of Fairmont. After that night's storm, Samuel Rutledge acted quickly on Rachel's advice. On July 22, he paid a visit to Judge James Haverhill, pretending to discuss cotton equipment and machinery. Both men knew the meeting had another purpose. Inside Haverhill's parlor, with its polished mahogany table and portraits of ancestors staring down from the walls, Samuel revealed what he had learned, details of Haverhill's failed land speculation in 1845, secret debts, and questionable business partners. Every word was true, and every word could destroy the magistrate's reputation. Haverhill's jaw tightened. The air turned cold. The men spoke politely, but beneath their voices ran a current of fear and fury. If such rumors spread, Haverhill would lose his position, his respect, and his chance at higher office. Rutledge offered a way out. A partnership, A cotton factoring business that would protect both their interests. In truth, it was blackmail hidden behind fine words. After half an hour of forced civility, they struck a deal. Haverhill would invest $3,000. Rutledge's debts would be cleared, and in return, he would publicly support Haverhill's political ambitions. Rutledge left the house feeling victorious. He believed his family's troubles were over. He didn't ask himself how Rachel knew so much about the Haverhills. He never wondered who her sources were. Rachel accepted the news calmly, almost serenely. She never revealed that her information came not from her former employers, but from a quiet network of enslaved people who carried news across plantations, exchanging whispers while their masters slept. It was a web of communication more powerful than anyone in Limestone County could imagine. Still, not everyone at Fairmont was blind. The cook, old Bess, watched Rachel with wary eyes. "That woman ain't right," she murmured to the others. "I seen her kind before. Down in Mobile, 3 families broke apart after she come. People died, couldn't prove nothin'. Most dismissed Bess as superstitious. Rachel had done nothing wrong. She was respectful, capable, almost gentle. But beneath her calm exterior, she was already planning her next move. Her new target was Lydia. Throughout August, the lessons continued as usual: French conversation, needlework, reading. But the topics began to change. Rachel spoke softly about the world beyond the plantation. About how women had no control over their own lives. About how the same laws that allowed men to own slaves also allowed them to control their wives and daughters. "You and I," Rachel said one afternoon, "are not so different. You may be dressed in silk, and I in cotton, but both of us are property. The difference is only in price." Lydia listened, first confused, then fascinated. Rachel's words put shape to feelings she'd never dared express: the frustration of being treated as an object, the fear of a life decided for her. "Your father," Rachel continued, "plans to marry you to Thomas Crenshaw. He needs the alliance. Have you been asked what you want?" Lydia's eyes widened. "How do you know this?" "I've seen the letters," Rachel said. "He's already discussing the dowry." It wasn't entirely true. Samuel had mentioned the Crenshaws only in passing, but Rachel twisted speculation into certainty, and Lydia, naive and sheltered, believed her. "I don't love Thomas Crenshaw," Lydia whispered. "Love," Rachel replied softly, "is not a concern in such arrangements. You are inventory, Miss Lydia, valuable, but inventory nonetheless." Over the next weeks, Lydia began to change. She grew restless, moody, secretive. She started keeping a journal, encouraged by Rachel, filling its pages with thoughts about freedom, injustice, and self-determination. Rachel read every word. By September, Samuel's financial scheme with Haverhill was falling apart. The cotton prices had dropped, and the partnership was failing. Worse, Haverhill had begun to gossip about Samuel's debts. When Rachel told him this, her tone was sympathetic, but her words were calculated to ignite his pride. "He means to ruin you," she warned. "He wants to walk away clean while your name is dragged through the mud." Samuel's anger exploded. At a county meeting a few days later, he publicly confronted Haverhill. The argument turned into a shouting match that left both men humiliated. The gossip spread through every plantation from Athens to Huntsville. Rachel watched it unfold in silence. 2 families were now at war, and she had lit the fuse. Then came September 18, 1847. Lydia was gone. Her room was empty, her clothes missing, and a letter lay on her desk. In it, she declared her intention to reject her father's control and pursue a life of independence and natural rights. Catherine recognized the phrasing. It wasn't her daughter's voice. It was Rachel's. Panic swept through Fairmont. Samuel launched search parties, sending riders across the county. Catherine fainted and took to her bed. The enslaved workers were interrogated, some beaten. Rachel wept convincingly, claiming to know nothing. Her performance was flawless. For 3 weeks, the search continued. Notices appeared in newspapers. Rewards were offered. Haverhill spread whispers that Rutledge had allowed his daughter to fall under the influence of dangerous ideas. The truth was far worse. Lydia had not escaped alone. Rachel had arranged her departure using secret contacts, a network of free black families and runaway slaves who moved people quietly along the river routes. Lydia believed she was claiming her freedom. In truth, she was being used to destroy her father's reputation completely. As the Rutledges descended into chaos, Rachel turned her gaze elsewhere, to Oak Ridge. Daniel Crenshaw, the practical, stoic widower, met her at a social gathering in August. He was struck by her intelligence and calm authority. A few weeks later, hearing of Samuel's misfortunes, he offered to buy Rachel for $900, a fortune for a house servant. Desperate for money and convinced Rachel had nothing to do with his daughter's disappearance, Samuel agreed. On October 3, 1847, Rachel left Fairmont for the Crenshaw estate. Behind her, she left ruin, Lydia gone, Catherine ill, Samuel's fortune collapsing. As her wagon rolled down the muddy road, old Bess stood at the kitchen door and crossed herself. "Lord have mercy on the Crenshaws," she whispered. "That woman carries destruction like a plague." The October rains came early that year. The plantations grew quiet, cut off by flooded roads. And in that gray isolation, Rachel arrived at Oak Ridge, calm, watchful, and ready to begin again. Daniel Crenshaw prided himself on being immune to nonsense. A practical man, a businessman, a man of reason, he believed no woman could sway his judgment. He was wrong, because Rachel had already decided, before the first frost fell, the Crenshaw family would follow the same path as the Rutledges. And the next chapter of her design was about to begin. End of Part 2, The Disappearance of Lydia. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for Part 3, where Rachel's influence spreads through Oak Ridge and a new terror begins to grow under the shadow of the Crenshaw estate. Would you like me to write Part 3, 1000 words, same horror historic YouTube style, next? Title: The Shadow at Oak Ridge, Part 3. Historic horror story inspired by true events. Hook. They thought she was just a servant, obedient, efficient, harmless. But by the time they realized who Rachel really was, Oak Ridge was already rotting from within. Every polite smile she gave was a blade hidden in silk. And by the end of that winter, the proud Crenshaw family would learn what it meant to invite a curse into their home. When Rachel arrived at Oak Ridge Plantation, she knew immediately this family would require a different kind of attack. Daniel Crenshaw wasn't like Samuel Rutledge. He couldn't be tricked with flattery or feminine charm. Daniel was practical, proud, and sharp. His world ran on numbers and soil, not gossip and ego. So Rachel changed her mask. Instead of dazzling with grace, she became quiet, precise, and indispensable. She managed the accounts with flawless accuracy. She found small ways to cut expenses and spoke wisely about crop rotation and the changing cotton market. Daniel began trusting her judgment more than anyone else's. Within weeks, he was asking her opinion on machinery purchases, land deals, and trade routes. That shift didn't go unnoticed. Margaret Crenshaw, Daniel's daughter, had managed the household since her mother's death. She was practical, intelligent, and fiercely loyal to her father. When Rachel arrived and began taking over, Margaret felt a slow burn of resentment. Still, what bothered her most wasn't the loss of her authority, it was the mystery surrounding Rachel. One cold evening in November, as the family gathered near the fire, Margaret finally spoke her thoughts. "Father," she said carefully, "don't you find it strange that this woman knows so much? She's educated beyond what any servant should be. The Rutledge family began to fall apart right after buying her. Do you not think that's suspicious?" Daniel frowned. "Margaret, that's nonsense. The Rutledge family destroyed themselves. Rachel is an asset, not a threat. Don't let your imagination run wild." Margaret said no more, but inside, she made a silent promise, she would watch Rachel. From that night forward, she noticed everything, the way Rachel listened to conversations that didn't concern her, how her eyes followed visiting merchants, how she studied letters as if memorizing names and figures. Margaret couldn't prove anything yet, but she knew. Rachel wasn't serving Oak Ridge. She was studying it. Rachel, meanwhile, understood perfectly what she was up against. The Crenshaws couldn't be manipulated by fear or vanity. They were too grounded for that. So she waited, watched, listened, until, finally, she discovered Daniel's weakness. It was written in ink, in his ledgers. For all his wealth and confidence, Daniel Crenshaw was deeply in debt. He'd been borrowing small sums for months, just enough to stay afloat while hiding the truth. Rachel traced the pattern. The loans were tied to a secret project, something that could ruin him if it failed. By late December, she knew the truth. Daniel was trying to buy new land, nearly doubling the size of Oak Ridge. He was gambling everything on cotton prices staying high. If the market dipped, he'd lose everything. Rachel smiled as she closed the ledger. She didn't need to ruin Daniel yet, she just needed to wait until his pride pulled him to the edge. That edge appeared in January 1848, in the form of a desperate man, James Haverhill. Haverhill had once been a partner to Samuel Rutledge, and his fortune had crumbled after that venture failed. Now he came to Oak Ridge, begging Daniel to join a new business scheme. It was a chance for Daniel to get the capital he needed for his land purchase. Rachel served tea quietly while the men talked, pretending to be invisible, but she caught every word. After Haverhill left, Rachel saw her opening. "Sir," she said gently, "I don't wish to interfere, but I once worked at Fairmont when Mr. Haverhill was there. He destroyed the Rutledge family. He used false contracts and deceit. If you partner with him, you may lose everything." It was a complete lie, a reversal of the story she'd told Samuel months earlier, but Daniel couldn't know that. For the next few days, Rachel fed his doubts in small doses. A word here, a warning there. Enough to let suspicion bloom naturally. By the end of the week, Daniel rejected Haverhill's offer. And just like that, Rachel had turned two powerful men against each other. Haverhill, furious and humiliated, blamed the Rutledges for poisoning Crenshaw's mind. The county's three richest families, Rutledge, Crenshaw, and Haverhill, were now bound together by hatred. But Rachel wasn't finished. To destroy Oak Ridge completely, she needed a wound that would bleed from within. She found it in Daniel's son, William Crenshaw. Through whispers from enslaved workers traveling between town and plantation, Rachel learned that William had secretly married Anna Pritchard, the daughter of a poor shopkeeper in Athens. Anna was already pregnant. Rachel now held a weapon sharper than any blade. On February 19, she made sure a letter from Anna to William, accidentally, reached Daniel's hands before his son could claim it. The old man read it, his face turning red with fury. By the time William came home that night, the storm had broken loose. "You disgrace me," Daniel shouted. "You've ruined this family's name." "I've married her already," William said quietly. "You can't undo it. Then you're no son of mine." Daniel cast him out that night. Disinherited. Banished. Rachel watched the scene unfold with calm satisfaction. The family that once stood like stone now crumbled before her eyes. But she wasn't done yet. In March 1848, a creditor's agent named Josiah Fletcher arrived at Oak Ridge, demanding $8,000 in overdue payments. Fletcher's timing was no coincidence. Rachel had made sure he came now, when Daniel was weakest. To save his land, Daniel made a desperate, horrifying choice. He sold 20 enslaved people, many from families who had served Oak Ridge for years. Parents were torn from children, husbands from wives. Margaret stood at the auction and saw Rachel's mask slip for just a second, not pity, not horror, but calculation. That night, Margaret confronted her. "You did this," she hissed. "You caused all of it. My father's ruin, my brother's exile, the auction, everything." Rachel looked at her without fear. "Miss Margaret, I'm property. I have no power. Your family's suffering comes from your father's own choices." "You're a liar," Margaret said. "And I'll prove it. When I do, you'll hang." Rachel smiled slightly. "To prove it, you'd have to admit that your family was destroyed by someone you call property. Do you think you could live with that truth?" Margaret said nothing. She knew Rachel was right. By April 1848, three families, the Rutledges, the Crenshaws, and the Haverhills, had all fallen into ruin. All had once trusted the same woman. And yet none could touch her, because Rachel had broken no laws that men recognized. She had stolen nothing, killed no one, but she had poisoned everything. And now, as summer approached, her work was nearly complete. Only one piece remained, A partnership that would end in blood and force the world to finally see what Rachel really was. To be continued in Part 4, The Devil's Bargain. If you want to know how Rachel's revenge turns deadly, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Title: The Shadow at Oak Ridge, Part 4. Historic horror story inspired by true events. Hook. By the summer of 1848, whispers of misfortune had spread across the Alabama countryside. 3 great families had fallen one after another, their estates sinking into ruin. And at the center of it all was a woman named Rachel, soft-spoken, intelligent, and impossibly calm. They said she never raised her voice, never lost her temper, and never forgot a thing. What no one realized was that Rachel wasn't finished. Her plan had only just begun, and the next part of her game would draw blood. The heat of June settled over Oak Ridge like a heavy blanket. The cotton fields shimmered in the sun, and the air smelled of dust and sorrow. After the slave auction in March, the plantation felt hollow. The laughter of children was gone, replaced by silence and fear. Daniel Crenshaw walked the fields every morning, trying to convince himself he still controlled his world, but Rachel could see the truth. His pride was cracking. Daniel had aged 10 years in a few months. His son William was gone, his daughter Margaret barely spoke to him, and his debts kept growing despite every sacrifice. The land he had tried to buy still waited, but now it mocked him, reminding him of what he had lost. Rachel continued to work quietly, managing what remained of Oak Ridge with flawless skill. To Daniel, she was his only dependable ally. He trusted her completely. When he couldn't sleep, he'd ask her to sit near the fire and read reports from Mobile or Savannah aloud. He found comfort in her calm, measured voice. Rachel watched him carefully. She knew when to speak and when to remain silent. Every word she used was chosen to lead him closer to ruin. She understood his weaknesses better than he did, his obsession with control, his fear of failure, his secret belief that God had chosen him for greatness. Meanwhile, Margaret Crenshaw had not forgotten their conversation. She kept her promise to watch Rachel. Every letter that came to the house, every merchant who visited, every servant who whispered, Margaret noticed. But Rachel was always careful. She left no trace that could be called proof. Then, in late June, a new visitor came to Oak Ridge, a man named Edmund Fairbanks, a cotton factor from Mobile. He arrived in a fine carriage with polished brass fittings, his manner polite but cold. Fairbanks had money, connections, and, most importantly, an interest in doing business with Daniel Crenshaw. At first, Daniel saw him as a savior. Fairbanks offered to help sell Oak Ridge's cotton directly to European buyers, cutting out middlemen and increasing profits. It sounded like redemption. Daniel could repay debts, restore his reputation, maybe even buy back the land he'd sold. But Rachel saw something else. When Fairbanks mentioned his acquaintance with James Haverhill, Daniel's expression darkened. Haverhill had come to him months earlier with a similar proposal, and Rachel had made sure Daniel turned him away. Now Haverhill was nearly ruined, desperate, and bitter. Fairbanks spoke of him casually, calling him reckless, a man whose downfall was his own doing. Daniel agreed, too eager to distance himself from failure. But that conversation lit a spark in Rachel's mind. She saw her final path. That evening, while serving wine on the veranda, she lingered close enough to hear Fairbanks and Daniel speak privately. Fairbanks was cautious but curious about her. "That woman," he said, "your housekeeper, she carries herself unlike any servant I've met." "Who is she really?" Daniel smiled faintly. "The most capable person I've ever employed. If every worker here had her discipline, Oak Ridge would be the finest estate in Alabama." Rachel bowed her head as if embarrassed. In truth, she was studying Fairbanks with sharp attention. He was ambitious, shrewd, and not burdened by loyalty. She could use him. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Rachel walked to the small office off the kitchen. There, she wrote a letter in a neat, graceful hand, addressed to Mr. James Haverhill of Riverside Plantation. The words were polite, almost sympathetic. She told him that Daniel Crenshaw was planning to partner with Edmund Fairbanks, the same man who, Haverhill believed, had cheated him in a previous venture. She wrote that Fairbanks had spoken of Haverhill with contempt, calling him weak and unreliable. She ended the letter with a simple suggestion: perhaps it was time for Mr. Haverhill to defend his reputation before Mr. Fairbanks destroyed it entirely. The next morning, one of the field hands carried that letter toward Riverside. A week later, the spark became a blaze. James Haverhill arrived at Oak Ridge in a fury. He demanded to see Fairbanks immediately. Daniel, caught between them, tried to calm things down, but the men shouted accusations across the dining room. Fairbanks swore he had never insulted Haverhill, while Haverhill accused him of theft, deceit, and betrayal. Rachel stood in the corner, silent, her expression unreadable. The argument ended only when Haverhill stormed out, swearing vengeance. Daniel was shaken. He turned to Rachel later that evening and asked, "How do men like that rise so high only to destroy each other?" Rachel answered softly, "Because they believe they can't be beaten. And that's always when they fall." He looked at her strangely, sensing something beneath her words, but said nothing. That night, thunder rolled across the horizon, and rain began to fall. Rachel sat by the window, watching lightning flash over the fields. In her mind, everything was aligning. The Rutledges were ruined. The Crenshaws were collapsing. Haverhill's rage would soon ignite something no one could control. But even Rachel, with all her careful planning, didn't yet realize that the final act of her story would summon something darker than vengeance, something that had waited, patient and silent, for her call. By early July, strange things began happening at Oak Ridge. The livestock grew restless, refusing to feed. Lamps flickered though the air was still. Servants spoke of footsteps in the hall at night when everyone was asleep. One evening, Margaret heard singing coming from the old smokehouse behind the kitchen, low, mournful, and in a language she didn't recognize. When she went to look, the place was empty, but a circle of ash marked the dirt floor. The next morning, Rachel was in the parlor as if nothing had happened, reading through account books. Margaret's voice trembled when she asked, "What are you doing to this house?" Rachel looked up with calm eyes. "Nothing that wasn't already begun long before I came here, Miss Margaret. I'm only helping the truth find its way home." Her words sent a chill through the room. Outside, thunder rumbled again though the sky was clear. Something unseen had begun to move through Oak Ridge, something drawn by the pain and anger Rachel had sown. The families she'd broken were about to face a new horror, one born not of revenge, but of reckoning. To be continued in Part 5, Voices in the Walls. If you want to know what awakens inside Oak Ridge, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Title: Voices in the Walls, Part 5. Historic horror story based on true events. Hook. By late summer of 1848, Oak Ridge Plantation was drowning in silence. The laughter that once echoed through its grand halls had vanished. The workers whispered about shadows that moved when no one was there and voices that murmured inside the walls at night. But Daniel Crenshaw refused to believe in ghosts. He told himself his mind was playing tricks on him. Yet deep down, he knew something unnatural had taken hold of his house. And at the center of it all was Rachel, the calm, unreadable woman who smiled as the world around her fell apart. The storm that struck Oak Ridge in early July marked a change no one could explain. Trees split in half. The stables flooded. The air inside the big house grew thick, heavy, and strangely cold at night. Servants claimed to hear a child crying near the old smokehouse. Others said they saw a figure standing in the fields during the lightning storms, tall and still, watching the house. Margaret Crenshaw stopped sleeping. She began keeping a lamp lit through the night. She told her father the house was cursed, but Daniel only shook his head. "Cursed," he said. "We are suffering from poor fortune, not witchcraft." But even Daniel couldn't ignore what happened next. One evening, while checking his ledgers in the study, Daniel heard a faint knocking sound from inside the wall behind his desk. He thought perhaps a mouse had gotten trapped. He took a candle and leaned close. The sound grew louder, more deliberate. 3 knocks. Then silence. Then 3 more. He felt a chill rise up his spine. The next morning, Rachel found him at breakfast, pale and quiet. "You look troubled, sir," she said. "It's nothing," he muttered. "Just this house settling." Rachel gave a soft smile. Old houses hold memories, Mr. Crenshaw. Sometimes they remember things their owners have forgotten. Margaret looked up sharply. What does that mean? Rachel only turned away, her face unreadable. Days passed. The knocking continued, spreading through other parts of the house. The servants were terrified. One ran away during the night. Another swore she saw Rachel standing in the yard speaking to someone who wasn't there. When confronted, Rachel said she had been praying. But Margaret didn't believe her. She started writing down every strange thing that happened. By the end of July, her journal was filled with notes, flickering lamps, cold air, whispers of names that belonged to the enslaved families sold away in March. Meanwhile, Daniel's debts grew worse. His crops were failing, buyers from Mobile delayed payments. Even his few allies in town began avoiding him. The once proud master of Oak Ridge was now a broken man who barely left his property. Rachel remained calm through it all, as if the chaos around her only strengthened her resolve. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried strange weight. Sometimes, she said one evening as thunder rolled outside, the past will not stay buried. Especially when it was buried alive. That night, Margaret awoke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. She thought it was her father, but when she called out, no one answered. She opened her door and saw candlelight coming from the parlor below. Quietly, she descended the stairs. Rachel was there, standing before the fireplace, murmuring softly. The air around her shimmered like heat rising from a road. Margaret couldn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone. It was a prayer, or something close to one, but not in English. The flames in the hearth flickered blue for a moment, and Margaret gasped. Rachel turned, her expression calm. You shouldn't wander at night, Miss Margaret. There are things in this house you wouldn't want to meet in the dark. The next morning, Margaret told her father what she'd seen. Daniel refused to listen. Rachel is the only one keeping this household together, he snapped. Without her, Oak Ridge would fall apart completely. Father, Margaret said, trembling, it already has. By mid-August, more strange events followed. Tools moved on their own in the barn. The horses screamed at shadows. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though nothing burned. Then, one night, Daniel was awakened by shouting. He ran downstairs to find the parlor door wide open. Margaret stood there, shaking, pointing toward the far wall. There, she whispered. Behind the boards. Daniel listened. From behind the wall came the faint sound of crying, soft, hopeless weeping. He tore the paneling open with a poker, revealing nothing but dust and brick. The sound stopped. Rachel appeared at the doorway moments later, candle in hand. What happened? She asked. Daniel's hands were shaking. Do you hear it? He demanded. Rachel tilted her head. Hear what, sir? Margaret stepped forward, furious. Stop pretending. You're doing this. You've brought something into this house. Tell us what you've done. Rachel's expression hardened. You accuse me because you fear what you cannot understand. You believe your blood makes you safe. But sin doesn't care about blood, Miss Margaret. It calls to everyone who's guilty. Daniel shouted at both of them to stop, but Margaret's eyes never left Rachel. Later that night, Daniel sat alone in his study, staring at the portrait of his late wife. He whispered to the empty room, God help me, what have I brought into my home? The candle beside him flickered out. Then, in the dark, he heard it again, the knocking. Slow, steady, coming from right behind his chair. He turned. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw a hand press against the wallpaper from inside the wall. Then it vanished. By morning, Daniel's hair had gone visibly gray. He told Margaret they were leaving Oak Ridge, selling what remained, starting over. But when he summoned Rachel to inform her, she only smiled. You can't leave, she said softly. The house isn't finished with you yet. Margaret screamed at her, demanding to know what she meant. Rachel simply turned away. That night, the storm returned, violent and merciless. The lightning lit the sky, and thunder rattled the glass panes. Daniel paced the floor, praying. The servants huddled in the kitchen, afraid to sleep. Margaret sat by her window, clutching her mother's old cross. Near midnight, a scream tore through the house. The servants ran to the upper hall. Daniel's study door was open, papers scattered everywhere. But Daniel himself was gone. Only his chair remained, still rocking gently as if someone had just stood up. They searched the property until dawn. No trace, no footprints, no blood. When the sun rose, Rachel stood on the veranda, staring out over the drenched fields. Margaret came to her, eyes red from crying. "What happened to him?" she demanded. Rachel looked toward the distant horizon, her voice calm and low. "The past came calling, and your father answered." Margaret froze. "You mean ease?" Rachel turned to her and smiled faintly. "Some debts aren't paid with money, Miss Margaret. Some are paid with souls." The wind rose, carrying the faint echo of knocking from somewhere deep within the house. Margaret ran, screaming for help, but no one dared enter the study again. From that day forward, Oak Ridge was never the same. Doors opened by themselves, candles lit without a spark. And every night, when the wind blew from the east, you could still hear Daniel Crenshaw's voice calling faintly from the walls, begging for forgiveness that would never come. To be continued in Part 6, The Devil's Ledger. If you're still brave enough to follow the story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Title: Voices in the Walls, Part 6. Historic horror story based on true events. Hook. After Daniel Crenshaw vanished inside his own home, Oak Ridge Plantation became a graveyard of whispers. Doors creaked open by themselves, portraits tilted on the walls, and at night, the sound of soft knocking echoed through the halls like a heartbeat trapped inside the wood. His daughter, Margaret, refused to leave. She believed her father's spirit was still there, crying for help from beyond the walls. But the longer she stayed, the more the house began to change her. The morning after Daniel disappeared, Oak Ridge seemed hollow. The servants spoke in whispers and refused to enter the study. Margaret sat alone at the dining table, her breakfast untouched. Rachel stood quietly nearby, pouring tea as if nothing had happened. Margaret finally broke the silence. "You knew this would happen," she said, her voice trembling. Rachel didn't look up. "Your father made his choices," she replied. "The house only took what it was owed." Margaret slammed her hand on the table. "You speak as if this place is alive." Rachel gave her a long, unreadable look. "Maybe it is." That night, Margaret went into her father's study for the first time since he vanished. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of wet earth. She lit a candle and whispered, "Father, if you can hear me, please, show me." The flame flickered. The knocking began again. This time it came from the floor beneath her. She knelt down, pressing her ear to the wood. The sound grew louder. 3 knocks, a pause, 3 more. Her heart raced. She grabbed a poker from the fireplace and pried up a loose board. Beneath it, she found a small leather-bound book covered in dust and age. It was her father's ledger. But when she opened it, it wasn't filled with numbers or transactions. It was full of names, names of men, women, and children. Next to each one was a mark, like a symbol, drawn in ink so dark it looked almost burned into the page. At the bottom of the list was a final entry: Rachel Holloway. Margaret froze. "Rachel," she whispered. The candle flickered again, then went out. She ran from the room, clutching the ledger to her chest. The next morning, she confronted Rachel. "My father had your name in his ledger," Margaret said. "Why? Who are you?" Rachel's calm expression didn't change. "He remembered me," she said quietly. "Most men don't." "Remembered you? For what?" Rachel's eyes darkened. "Your father bought my family," she said. "Then he sold us when the debts came due. My mother died in those fields. I died with her. But the land remembers us. The walls remember. And now, you will too." Margaret stepped back, horrified. "That's impossible. You're alive." Rachel smiled faintly. "Am I?" Before Margaret could speak again, the floorboards creaked. The chandelier above them swayed though no wind blew. The air grew cold, and from the walls came faint voices, crying, whispering, begging. Rachel closed her eyes and whispered something under her breath. The sounds stopped instantly. She looked at Margaret and said, "This house has been feeding on guilt for generations. It doesn't stop until the truth is spoken aloud." Margaret clutched the ledger tighter. "Then tell me the truth. Rachel turned away and walked toward the study. You'll see it soon enough. That night, Margaret could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she dreamed of the names in the ledger, each one whispering her father's name. She awoke just before dawn and went downstairs. The study door stood open, candlelight flickering inside. Rachel was sitting at the desk, writing in the ledger with a quill. Margaret's voice shook. What are you doing? Rachel didn't look up. Finishing it. Margaret moved closer. You can't. Rachel looked at her then, and for the first time, Margaret saw something in her eyes, pain, but also something older, darker. I didn't come back for revenge, Rachel said softly. I came to finish the story your father began. To make the record right. She turned the ledger toward Margaret. A new name had appeared, Margaret Crenshaw. Margaret's blood ran cold. No, I didn't do anything. Rachel stood and walked toward her. The house doesn't care who did it. It only cares who carries the guilt. The windows rattled violently. The candle flames turned blue. Margaret stumbled backward as the portraits on the walls began to weep black streaks of soot. The house groaned, the sound of wood twisting under unbearable pressure. Rachel's voice rose above the chaos. Confess what your family did, and it will end. I don't know what to confess. Margaret cried. Rachel reached out her hand. Then it will take you too. The floor split open beneath them, revealing black earth beneath the boards. From it came the faint outlines of hands, dozens of them, reaching upward, clawing toward the light. Margaret screamed and ran. She fled up the stairs, down the hall, into her room. She locked the door and pressed her back to it, gasping. The knocking started again. This time, it came from inside her wardrobe. Father, she whispered. A voice answered, a voice that sounded like her father's, but broken, strained. Help me, Margaret. She opened the wardrobe door slowly. Nothing, only her dresses swaying on their hangers. Then, as she turned away, a cold hand grabbed her wrist. She screamed, pulling free and collapsing to the floor. The room filled with whispers, hundreds of them. Some calling her name, others laughing softly. The door burst open. Rachel stood there, candle in hand. It's begun, she said. What is this? Margaret sobbed. Rachel's expression softened. It's the reckoning. Every soul buried by your father's greed is waking. The house is remembering. And when it finishes remembering, no Crenshaw will remain. Margaret crawled to her feet, trembling. Then help me stop it. Rachel shook her head. You can't stop what's already been written. You can only face it. The light from her candle flared, revealing faces on the walls, dozens of faint outlines, each whispering, watching, waiting. Rachel turned away, walking down the hall. The past isn't through with us yet, she said. Not until the last debt is paid. The house creaked like an old beast awakening. Margaret clutched the ledger to her chest and whispered, then I'll find a way to pay it. Behind her, the knocking started again, slow, steady, endless. To be continued in Part 7, The Awakening. If you dare to keep listening, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for the next chapter. Title: Voices in the Walls, Part 7. Historic horror story based on true events. Hook. By the winter of 1847, Oak Ridge Plantation had turned into a nightmare. The house that once symbolized wealth now whispered secrets of the dead. Every night, the walls groaned like they were alive, and strange lights flickered in the windows though no lamps burned. Margaret Crenshaw could no longer tell if she was awake or trapped inside a living dream. But Rachel Holloway knew, the house had finally begun to wake, and nothing could stop what was coming next. Snow fell softly over the empty fields, covering the broken fences and silent quarters. Inside, Oak Ridge stood in uneasy silence. Servants had fled weeks ago, terrified by the whispers that drifted through the hallways. Only Rachel and Margaret remained, each haunted in different ways. Margaret sat in her father's study again, staring at the ledger. She had tried to burn it twice, but each time the flames went out on their own. The pages refused to burn, as if the names written there were bound by something older and stronger than paper. She whispered to herself, if I can understand it, maybe I can end it. Rachel entered quietly, her presence calm but heavy. Understanding won't stop it, she said. The house wants balance. It remembers every sin, every scream, every drop of blood spilled on this soil. Margaret looked up. Then tell me what it wants from me. Rachel moved closer to the fire, watching the embers glow. It wants you to see, she said. It wants the truth told aloud, so no one forgets again. Margaret shivered. The truth about what? Rachel's voice dropped to a whisper. What your father and Haverhill did. What they buried beneath this land. Margaret frowned. The ledgers. The debts. Rachel shook her head. The bodies. Margaret's heart stopped. No. That's impossible. Rachel met her eyes. You think this house bleeds for nothing? You think the walls moan because of wind? The ground under this plantation is filled with the dead, men and women worked to death, beaten, buried without name or prayer. And your father made it worse. Margaret covered her mouth. You're lying. Rachel's face hardened. You saw his ledger. You saw my name. Silence hung between them. The fire flickered weakly, and then, for a brief second, it glowed green. Rachel turned toward the window. It's starting again. Outside, the snow shimmered strangely, like something was moving beneath it. Faint footprints appeared, leading from the woods toward the house. The sound of chains dragged across the porch. Margaret stood, terrified. Who's there? A voice, low and distant, whispered back. Margaret, she gasped. That's my father's voice. Rachel shook her head slowly. No, it's what's left of him. The front door creaked open on its own. Cold air swept through the hallway, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and decay. Rachel stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the dark entryway. The house is calling us downstairs. Margaret hesitated. Why would we go toward it? Because, Rachel said softly, you can't escape the truth by hiding from it. They descended the staircase together, the floorboards groaning with every step. The air grew colder as they reached the cellar door. Margaret's candle flickered wildly, but she refused to turn back. Rachel pushed open the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp soil. In the center of the cellar stood a mound of earth, like a fresh grave. Above it hung a single lantern, swinging gently though there was no breeze. Margaret whispered, "What is that?" Rachel looked at her. It's where it began. The ground shifted. Something moved beneath the soil, slow but deliberate. A hand, pale, ghostly, and dirt-covered, broke through the surface. Then another. Margaret screamed, stumbling backward. No, this isn't real. Rachel's face was calm, her eyes fixed on the rising figure. It's as real as every life your father took. From the mound, a shadowy form began to take shape. A man, his face twisted, his eyes empty. His mouth opened, and a deep, broken voice said, "You left me here." Margaret fell to her knees. "Father." Rachel stepped between them. "He's not your father anymore. He belongs to this house now." The ghostly figure turned its hollow gaze toward Rachel. "You brought this upon them." Rachel didn't flinch. "I didn't bring it. I freed it." The walls began to shake. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the lantern flickered violently. The floor cracked open, revealing dark water below. Whispers filled the room, rising into screams. Margaret clutched the ledger. "What do I do? Tell me how to stop this." Rachel turned to her, eyes burning. "You can't stop it, Margaret. But you can end the curse." "How?" "By giving back what was stolen." Margaret looked around wildly. "What was stolen?" Rachel's voice softened. "Peace." Suddenly, the ghostly figure lunged forward, reaching for Margaret. She screamed, raising the ledger like a shield. As the shadow touched it, a burst of light filled the cellar. The ghost shrieked, then vanished, leaving behind only the faint sound of weeping. When the light faded, Rachel stood beside Margaret, her face pale but calm. "It's not over," she said. "You've only silenced one voice. There are many more." Margaret stared at her. "Then what happens to me?" Rachel placed a hand on her shoulder. "That depends on whether you choose truth or denial." As they climbed the stairs, the house moaned like a wounded creature. The portraits on the walls had changed. Faces once stern now seemed sorrowful, almost pleading. Rachel paused at the top of the stairs and looked back down the hallway. The house won't rest until every secret is unearthed. Margaret followed her gaze. "Then I'll find them," she whispered. "I'll uncover everything my father hid." Rachel smiled faintly. Be careful what you uncover. Some truths don't want to be found. That night, as Margaret sat by the fire reading through the ledger again, the ink on the pages began to move, shifting to form new words. The last debt is not paid. She dropped the book in shock. The fire dimmed, and from the shadows behind her, Rachel's voice whispered softly. It's waiting for the final name. Margaret turned. Whose name? Rachel's eyes met hers. Yours. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows. The lights flickered once, then went out. And somewhere deep beneath Oak Ridge, the voices began to chant her name. To be continued in Part 8, The Reckoning. If you're still brave enough to listen, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for Part 8. Title: Voices in the Walls, Part 8. Historic horror story based on true events. Hook. The night Margaret read her own name in the ledger, Oak Ridge changed forever. The house no longer whispered. It spoke. The portraits watched her every move, the floors trembled when she prayed, and Rachel, who once seemed like flesh and blood, now appeared more like something ancient wearing human skin. Margaret had survived the curse so far, but now she understood the terrifying truth: she wasn't fighting to save Oak Ridge anymore. She was fighting to save her soul. The next morning, fog blanketed the fields so thick that even the nearest trees were only gray shadows. Margaret woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway, but when she opened her door, no one was there. The air was colder than it should have been for summer. She walked downstairs, clutching the ledger to her chest. The once grand dining room was now empty, the silver tarnished, the curtains torn. Rachel was sitting at the table, her hands folded neatly, staring at a single candle flame. You didn't sleep, Margaret said softly. Rachel looked up, her face unreadable. The house doesn't sleep, and neither do I. Margaret hesitated. What happens now? Rachel's voice was calm but heavy. The last debt must be paid. The house remembers every life it consumed, every lie it buried. Until balance is restored, it will keep calling. Margaret opened the ledger, its pages fluttering on their own as if turned by invisible hands. The ink glowed faintly. It wrote my name, she said. Why me? What have I done? Rachel stood. Because you're the last Crenshaw. The blood that built this land still runs in you. The sins of the fathers always fall on the children. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Then how do I make it stop? Rachel's gaze moved toward the window. You confess. You tell the truth that your family buried. Not to me, not to God, to them, the ones beneath us, Rachel said softly. The ones who never left. Outside, thunder rumbled though the sky was clear. The ground trembled, and from the fields came faint sounds, low moans, the echo of chains, voices rising like a distant storm. Margaret's knees weakened. What do they want from me? Rachel stepped closer. Justice. Suddenly, a crash echoed from the parlor. A portrait had fallen from the wall, Daniel Crenshaw's portrait. The canvas was split down the middle, and beneath it, something wet glistened. Margaret knelt to touch it and pulled back in horror. It was blood. Rachel spoke quietly. The house bleeds when truth is near. Margaret turned to her. Tell me everything. Tell me what my father did. Rachel's expression hardened. Your father made a pact. When the crops failed, when debts grew too heavy, he sold something no man should ever sell. Margaret's voice trembled. Sold what? Rachel met her eyes. Souls. He promised the overseer's men to the marshes for a harvest that would never fail. He buried them alive beneath the fields as an offering. Margaret gasped. That's not possible. Rachel's tone didn't change. You saw the hands rise from the cellar. Do you still believe it's impossible? The walls groaned again, louder this time. A gust of cold air blew through the room, extinguishing the candle. The entire house seemed to exhale. Margaret grabbed Rachel's arm. Then I'll confess. I'll tell the world what happened here. Rachel shook her head. No one will believe you. They'll say the Crenshaw daughter went mad. You must speak to them, the dead. Only they can release you. How? Rachel led her to the cellar door. With blood and truth. Margaret hesitated. I'm afraid. Rachel smiled faintly. Fear is the first step to freedom. They descended the steps, the candlelight flickering against the damp walls. The air grew heavy, filled with the smell of soil and rot. When they reached the bottom, the ground was moving again, slow and rhythmic, like breathing. Rachel set the candle in the dirt and knelt. You must call them by name. Margaret opened the ledger. The names shimmered faintly on the page, hundreds of them, fading in and out like ghosts. Her voice shook as she began to read. Isaac, Mary, Benjamin. With each name, the ground shifted. The air thickened until the candle flame stretched tall and blue. The cellar filled with whispers, soft at first, then rising into a chorus of grief. Margaret's voice broke. Forgive us. Forgive what my family did. A sudden wind snuffed the candle. Darkness swallowed them whole. From that darkness came a voice, deep and ancient. There is no forgiveness, only balance. Margaret screamed, then take me. Take me instead. Rachel's hand closed around hers. Careful what you offer, she whispered. The air turned icy. The shadows moved, forming faces, men, women, children, all staring at Margaret. One stepped forward, its eyes glowing faintly. You cannot pay for all of them, the spirit said. But you can end the line. Margaret fell to her knees. Then so be it. End it. The spirit reached forward, touching her forehead. Pain shot through her body, but she didn't move. When it withdrew, her skin burned where the touch had been, an old scar in the shape of a circle. The ground grew still. The whispers faded. The cellar fell silent again. Margaret looked up at Rachel. Is it over? Rachel's expression was unreadable. You've closed one door, but others remain open. Margaret's voice broke. What do you mean? Rachel stood, her shadow stretching unnaturally long. You think this curse began with your father. But it began with me. Margaret froze. With you. Rachel smiled faintly. Long before your father bought me, long before Oak Ridge was built, this land belonged to my people. They called it sacred. He defiled it, and I made sure it remembered. Margaret stepped back. You caused this. Rachel's eyes glowed in the dim light. I didn't cause it. I made it visible. The curse isn't vengeance, it's memory. I am what remains of every soul buried beneath this soil. Margaret's breath caught. You're not human. Rachel tilted her head. Not anymore. The candle flared back to life on its own, burning brighter than before. The shadows behind Rachel twisted and took shape, hundreds of faces flickering within them. Margaret whispered, What do you want from me? Rachel looked at her gently. To remember. To make sure no one forgets what was done here. The blood, the chains, the silence. Promise me you'll tell their story. Margaret nodded through tears. I swear it. Rachel smiled softly. Then the house will let you live. The cellar began to rumble. Dust fell from the beams. Rachel turned toward the darkness. My time here is done. Margaret reached out. Wait, where are you going? Rachel's figure began to fade, her body dissolving into light and smoke. Back to the soil, she whispered. Where it all began. The light vanished. The cellar was empty. Margaret stood alone, trembling, clutching the ledger to her chest. The house above her had grown silent again, but she knew it was only sleeping. As she climbed the stairs, morning sunlight poured through the cracked windows for the first time in months. Oak Ridge was quiet, peaceful, but when she opened the ledger one last time, a single new line had appeared. Rachel Holloway, debt paid. Margaret exhaled in relief. Then, as she turned the page, she saw one final entry forming slowly beneath it. Margaret Crenshaw, payment due. Her scream echoed through the empty halls as the house came alive once more. To be continued in Part 9, The Last Crenshaw. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe before the next haunting begins. Title: Voices in the Walls, Part 9. Historic horror story based on true events. Hook. When Margaret Crenshaw saw her name appear in the ledger, she realized the curse hadn't ended, it had simply changed form. The air inside Oak Ridge grew thick again. The mirrors reflected faces that weren't hers, and the walls whispered in voices that knew her secrets. Rachel had vanished, but her presence still lingered like a shadow that never moved. Margaret thought she'd survived. In truth, the house had just chosen its next sacrifice. The morning after Rachel disappeared, Oak Ridge looked almost peaceful. The birds sang outside for the first time in weeks, and sunlight poured through the broken shutters. Margaret sat at the dining table, the ledger open before her. The entry glowed faintly, Margaret Crenshaw, payment due. She stared at it for hours. No matter how many times she closed the book, when she reopened it, the same words waited for her. It felt like a promise written in blood. By afternoon, a group of neighbors arrived, concerned about the silence from the estate. Among them was Reverend Henry Ellis, a kind but superstitious man who had known the Crenshaw family for years. "Miss Margaret," he said gently, stepping into the ruined parlor. "We've heard stories. People say Oak Ridge is cursed. I came to pray with you." Margaret gave a small smile. "Prayer won't help, Reverend. Not here." He frowned. "Then what will?" "The truth," she said softly. "But the truth costs blood." The Reverend shifted uneasily. "You speak like the devil has hold of this place." Margaret closed the ledger and looked at him. "Not the devil. Something older." That night, she lit every candle in the house. The light flickered across the portraits, casting moving shadows on the walls. The air hummed faintly, like a heartbeat deep within the earth. Margaret began to read the ledger again, not to call the spirits this time, but to understand. Each name was written in the same careful hand, Rachel's. At the back of the book was something new, sketches of a circular symbol, drawn again and again. The mark that had burned itself into Margaret's forehead the night before. She traced it with her finger, and a chill ran down her spine. Somewhere above her, she heard footsteps. Heavy, slow, deliberate. She grabbed the nearest candle and went upstairs. At the top of the landing, the air was thick with dust. The smell of smoke lingered, though no fire burned. The footsteps stopped at her mother's old room. The door creaked open on its own. Margaret stepped inside. The room was untouched since her mother's death years ago, still filled with faint perfume and faded lace. On the dressing table sat a mirror, cracked down the center. In that mirror, Margaret saw not her reflection but Rachel standing behind her. "You promised to remember," Rachel's voice whispered. Margaret spun around, but no one was there. The candle flame bent sideways as if something unseen had moved through the air. "I am remembering," she shouted. The whisper came again, this time from the walls. "Then remember it all." The floorboards shook, and the room blurred. Margaret's vision darkened until she wasn't in her mother's room anymore. She stood in the past. The year was 1848. She saw her father, Daniel Crenshaw, standing at the edge of the fields, speaking with men in black coats. They stood around a deep pit, the sound of chains echoing from within. The men threw handfuls of soil into the hole, muttering something in Latin. Then Daniel pressed his hand against a piece of parchment and sealed it with wax. The scene faded, and Margaret fell to her knees, gasping. She understood now. The Crenshaws hadn't just buried bodies, they'd sealed a pact in blood and silence. The candle went out, plunging her into darkness. From the shadows came Rachel's voice again. "The land remembers, and so must you." Margaret whispered, trembling, "What do you want me to do?" Rachel's voice was close now, as if she were standing inches away. "End it." "How?" "Burn it." Margaret froze. "Burn Oak Ridge. Fire purifies. It's the only way to break the circle." She hesitated, tears in her eyes. "This is my home." Rachel's tone turned cold. "It was built on bones. You can't live in a grave." The next morning, Margaret walked the fields. The soil was dark and damp from the night rain. She knelt and pressed her hand into the earth. It felt alive, pulsing softly beneath her fingers. She whispered, "I'll set you free." That evening, she gathered oil lamps from the storage room and carried them through the halls. Each step echoed louder than the last. The portraits seemed to watch her as she poured the oil along the baseboards. As she worked, she heard the faint hum of voices, men, women, children. They weren't angry anymore. They were waiting. When she reached the parlor, she stopped before her father's portrait. "You did this," she said quietly. "And now I must finish it." The eyes in the portrait seemed to follow her. For a moment, she thought she saw it blink. She struck a match. The flame caught the oil instantly, racing along the wall like a living thing. Fire leapt from one curtain to the next, devouring everything it touched. Smoke filled her lungs, but she didn't stop. She moved room to room, lighting every corner, every hidden place where the house might try to keep its secrets. As the fire climbed the stairs, she heard footsteps behind her again, soft and steady. She turned and saw Rachel, her figure shimmering through the smoke. "You've done well," Rachel said. "Will it end now?" Margaret asked through coughs. Rachel's eyes glowed faintly. "For you, yes. For me, it already ended long ago." The ceiling cracked. Flames roared upward. Margaret stumbled toward the door, but Rachel caught her hand. Her skin was cool, almost soothing. "You'll see them again," Rachel whispered. "Every soul you set free will remember your name." Margaret smiled weakly. "Tell them I'm sorry." Rachel nodded once. "They already know." The floor collapsed, and the fire swallowed them both. By dawn, Oak Ridge was gone. The neighbors arrived to find only blackened earth where the mansion once stood. The air still smelled faintly of ash and something older, like rain on graves. Among the ruins, Reverend Ellis found the only thing untouched by fire, the ledger. Its pages were blank except for one final line written in crimson ink. "Margaret Crenshaw, debt paid in full." He closed the book, crossed himself, and walked away. But as he left, the wind turned a single page, and faint words began to appear again, written by an unseen hand. "One debt ends, another begins." From somewhere deep in the ashes came a whisper carried by the wind, soft, distant, and unmistakably Rachel's. "Not yet." To be continued in Part 10, Ashes and Echoes. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe before the final chapter burns its way into legend. Title: Voices in the Walls, Part 10, Final Chapter. A historic horror story based on true events. Hook. When the fire consumed Oak Ridge, everyone believed the curse had ended. But evil never dies, it only changes its name. The ashes of the Crenshaw estate still whispered when the wind blew, and beneath those blackened ruins, something ancient waited. Margaret's sacrifice wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far darker. The ruins of Oak Ridge smoldered for 3 days. Smoke curled into the sky like black ribbons, and the scent of burned wood mixed with something metallic, almost like blood. The townspeople gathered at a distance, whispering prayers and crossing themselves. Reverend Ellis stood at the edge of the property, clutching the old ledger wrapped in a burlap cloth. He had buried too many secrets in this land to believe they'd stay buried now. When the flames finally died, he walked the perimeter, muttering scripture under his breath. But even as he prayed, the ground beneath his boots trembled softly, as if the soil itself was breathing. He looked toward the center of the ruins where Margaret had last stood. The earth there was cracked open, deep and black. Inside the crevice, something glowed faintly red. Reverend Ellis swallowed hard. "Lord have mercy," he whispered, backing away. But the wind rose suddenly, and with it came a sound, faint, echoing, familiar. It was a woman's voice calling his name. He turned around. No one stood there. He left that night and never returned. But before leaving town, he locked the ledger in the church cellar, vowing to keep it sealed forever. Years passed. The world changed. The Civil War came and went, leaving scars across the South. Oak Ridge became a forgotten field, overgrown with weeds and vines. Only the bravest children dared to wander near it. They said if you stood there at dusk, you could still smell the smoke, and sometimes, if the light hit just right, you could see a woman standing in the ashes, her eyes glowing faintly gold. By 1904, the land was sold to a man named Edward Whitmore, a wealthy industrialist from New York. He had no patience for superstition. He planned to build a grand new home on the ruins, a modern mansion with gaslight, marble, and iron gates. When workers began digging the foundation, they unearthed fragments of stone, bone, and melted glass. At the very center of the dig site, they found a scorched leather book. The ledger. Edward didn't believe in ghosts. He laughed when the men refused to touch it. "It's just a book," he said, brushing off the ashes. He took it home that night, cleaned the cover, and placed it on his desk. When he opened it, every page was blank except one. Edward Whitmore, payment due. He frowned, thinking it must be a prank. He left the book open and went to bed. Sometime after midnight, the servants heard him scream. When they rushed into his room, the windows had shattered, and Edward was gone. The only thing left on the bed was the ledger, now with a fresh line written beneath his name. Debt collected. The mansion was never built. The workers fled, claiming the ground was cursed. Rain poured for days, flooding the foundation pit until it became a pond. Locals began to call it Crenshaw Hollow. In the years that followed, strange stories surrounded that place. A fisherman claimed he saw a pale hand reach up from the water. A traveler swore he heard a woman's voice whispering from the reeds. And late one night, a carriage driver passing by said he saw two figures walking along the shore, one dressed in white, the other in black, vanishing when the lightning struck. By 1931, the legend of Oak Ridge had become a ghost story told in hushed voices. Most people thought it was just old Southern folklore. But then, during a church renovation, Reverend Ellis's successor found something buried beneath the altar, a small box wrapped in cloth. Inside was the ledger, still warm to the touch. The new reverend didn't open it. He sealed it again, buried it deep beneath the church floor, and built a stone cross above the spot. He wrote in his diary, "The book breathes when it's near the living. God forgive whoever opens it next." Decades passed. Wars came and went. Technology grew. The old church was eventually abandoned, its roof collapsing from rot and rain. One summer afternoon in 2024, a team of historians from a nearby university arrived to document its remains. Among them was Dr. Emily Warren, a specialist in Southern history. As she sifted through debris, she found a small metal box. Inside lay a leather-bound book, perfectly preserved. She brushed away the dust. The title read, Oak Ridge Ledger. Curious, Emily flipped through the pages. They were blank, until she reached the last one. It read, Emily Warren, payment due. Her breath caught. She laughed nervously and closed the book. But as she turned to leave, she noticed something strange. The shadow on the wall wasn't hers. It was taller, older, and it smiled. That night, she dreamed of fire. Of a woman with golden eyes standing among ashes, whispering softly, "The debt never ends." When Emily woke, the book was on her nightstand, though she'd left it locked in her car. A faint glow pulsed beneath the cover, and from somewhere deep inside the leather, a heartbeat echoed. She opened the window to throw it out, but froze. In the reflection of the glass, she saw Margaret Crenshaw standing behind her. Margaret's voice was calm, almost kind. "You opened it. Now it's yours." Emily whispered, "What are you?" "The story," Margaret said. And stories never die. The next morning, Emily's car was found abandoned by the ruins of Oak Ridge. No sign of her was ever discovered. But locals say that on quiet nights, you can still hear her voice near the hollow, reading names from a book no one dares to touch. And if you listen closely, the last name she speaks might be yours. Call to action. If you've made it this far through the haunted history of Oak Ridge, you've felt the chill that never leaves. The story may be ending, but some doors never stay closed. So before the whispers find your name, make sure to subscribe, like, and share this story with someone brave enough to hear it. And tell us in the comments, would you dare open the ledger?